Ready? Go!
How's it going? I hope you've been well. Today we're taking a look at the Spirit Squadron pre-constructed commander deck from Innistrad Crimson Vow, and we're gonna give it the $50 upgrade treatment. This Precon is a go-wide Spirit tribal deck that wants to build a massive board of creatures and turn them sideways, with a commander that gets cheaper to cast with every spirit that hits the battlefield. It's an aggressive deck that's easy to pilot with some explosive finishers that are really exciting to pull off. In the video description below, you'll find timestamps for each section of the video, as well as a link to my upgraded deck list and a spreadsheet that neatly shows which cards have been kept, removed, and added. Starting off with the commander, the Spirit Squadron Precon gives us two options. We have the face commander, Millicent Restless Revenant, and the partner pairing of Rada Geist Avenger and Timon Youthful Geist. Just by looking at these commander options, it's clear that the Precon has two themes going on: Spirit Tribal and tapping creatures, whether it's our own creatures or our opponents. I wanted to really focus the synergy of the deck so that it would play out more consistently and have a very clear win condition, so I removed all of the tap theme cards and went all in on the Spirit Tribal synergy. With that being said, our Precon upgrade will have Millicent Restless Revenant leading the Spirit Squadron. Millicent is a 7-mana 4/4 legendary spirit soldier, but don't worry, we will never be paying 7 mana to play our commander because it costs 1 less to cast for each spirit we control. This effect can even get around commander tax, so you can expect to have your commander around for most of the game. Millicent is also a flying 4/4 that says whenever a non-token spirit you control dies or deals combat damage to a player, create a 1/1 spirit creature token with flying. And this also includes Millicent. So the game plan is pretty clear. We're gonna flood the board with spirits, and when our spirits get damaged through or die, we're gonna make even more spirits and do it all over again. Now that we have our commander settled, let's take a look at the rest of the 99 and see what cards from the Precon that we'll be keeping, removing, and adding. First up, we'll be keeping Rattle Chains, a 2-mana 2/1 spirit with flash and flying. When Rattle Chains enters the battlefield, target spirit gains hexproof until end of turn. So it's a cheap way to protect one of our other spirits from a removal spell at flash speed, but if any of our opponents have spirits, we could also use this as a political card and protect someone else's spirit in return for some kind of favor. And the bottom part of this card says you may cast spirit spells as though they had flash. So if we don't feel like holding this back as a hexproof spell, we can get it onto the battlefield as a Vidalcan Orrery for our spirits, which is a large majority of the deck. Remorseful Cleric is another 2-mana 2/1 flying spirit that we'll be keeping, and it's just a simple piece of graveyard hate. If need be, we can sacrifice Remorseful Cleric and exile someone's entire graveyard. Spectral Sailor is a 1-mana 1/1 spirit with flash and flying. Not too fancy, but it's a 1-drop, and keep in mind, with every spirit we get onto the battlefield, we are reducing the casting cost of our commander. So these 1- and 2-drop spirits might not be the spiciest of cards, but if you can get 1 out each turn, then we could be seeing Millicent on turn 3 or 4. At 3 mana, we're keeping the Spectral Shepherd, a flying 2/2 spirit that has pay 1 and a blue, return target spirit you control to its owner's hand. So if any of our spirits become the target of a removal spell, we can bounce it with Spectral Shepherd and play it again afterwards. And being a flying 2/2, we can likely get some combat damage through with this card. Supreme Phantom, not looking too supreme, being only 2 mana and a 1/3 in stats, but it's a flying spirit that gives a +1/+1 anthem effect to our other spirits, so it can stay in the deck. Investigate was another sub-theme that existed in this Precon, but I decided to keep Bygone Bishop in because it's a 2/3 flying spirit for 3 mana. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 3 or less, create a clue token. Because it's a flying spirit, we've checked all the tribal synergy boxes, and it's going to help us get combat damage through, so I don't really mind playing this for 3 mana. The clue tokens are a little added bonus that we don't care too much about, but most of the creatures in this deck cost 3 or less, so if Bygone Bishop does end up hanging around for a bit, we should be able to draw a couple of cards. Another creature in the Investigate sub-theme is Ethereal Investigator. It's a 4-mana 2/3, so pretty expensive for the stats, but it's a flying spirit that says when it enters the battlefield, you create X clue tokens, where X is the number of opponents you have. So typically, in a game of Commander, you'll have 3 opponents, so now it's a 4-mana 2/3 flying spirit that creates 3 clue tokens. Now, a minute ago, I did mention that we don't care all that much about the clue tokens. However, with Ethereal Investigator on the board, whenever we draw our second card each turn, we get to create a 1/1 flying spirit token. So again, it's a creature with tribal synergy. It has some bonus effects that we're not all that excited about, but hey, if it sticks around and generates some extra value, I won't complain. Another creature we'll be keeping that can help us draw some cards is Mentor of the Meek. It's not a spirit, but it's a 2/2 human for 3 mana that says, whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1 and draw a card. Again, we've got a lot of creatures in the deck with power 2 or less that we can cast. However, our commander Millicent can also generate creatures that trigger this effect. Nebelgast Herald is a card in the tap theme that I decided to keep in the deck because it's a 3-mana 2/1 spirit with flash and flying. I mostly kept it in for the tribal synergy at flash speed, but it does say whenever it or another spirit enters the battlefield under your control, you get to tap a creature an opponent controls. So the idea here is you play spirits and tap creatures down so that you can get your combat damage through, but for us, that's just going to be an added bonus that we don't care all that much about. Windborn Muse is another one of those creatures that's understated for its cost, but it's the tribal synergy and the effect that really matters. At 4 mana, we get a flying 2/3 spirit that says, creatures cannot attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. So it can make you an expensive target during the combat step, often encouraging your opponents to attack each other and leave you alone. But it's also a flyer, so we can probably find an opportunity to sneak some of our own damage in, and the combat tax is a static effect, so even if Windborn Muse swings in and taps, its effect is still active. Overall, a great spirit tribal card that can stay in the deck. Donnel Herald of Wings is a 4-mana 3/3 that I've seen a lot of people cutting from the Precon since it's kind of expensive and doesn't have any tribal synergy, but Donnel says whenever you cast a non-legendary creature spell with flying, you may copy it, and the copy is a 1/1 spirit in addition to its other types. Now you may have noticed, but 99% of the creatures in this deck are non-legendary creatures with flying, so if Donnel sticks around, we could be getting a 2-for-1 every turn. On top of that, some of our flying spirits have effects that would be even better a second time, so getting a copy with Donnel would be great, and the copy is a spirit which our commander cares about a lot. At roughly $2, this isn't a card that I would go out and buy for this deck, but it comes included in the Precon, so I'm happy to keep it in. Getting towards the end of creatures we'll be keeping in the deck, we have Drogskull Reinforcements, a 4-mana 2/2, but this is one of our win condition cards. Drogskull Reinforcements has melee, which is whenever this creature attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each opponent you attacked this combat. Other spirits you control also have this effect. And if that wasn't good enough, prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to spirits you control. So this is one of those cards that scales up in Commander because it says for each opponent you attacked. If you send your creatures at all 3 of your opponents, every spirit you control is going to get +3/+3 until end of turn. You could use this to spread your damage and knock out multiple people, or if you only have enough damage to eliminate one player, you can send all of your spirits but 2 at the one player, and send the other 2 spirits at the other 2 opponents. This will count as you attacking 3 separate opponents, but the majority of the damage will go at one player. Needless to say, you build up a huge board of spirits using Millicent and the other tools at your disposal, and then play Drogskull Reinforcements when you're ready to go in for the kill. Mirror Entity is another crazy win condition card that was also included in the Precon, so we're definitely keeping it around. For 3 mana, we get a 1/1 changeling that says pay X, and until end of turn, all creatures you control have base power and toughness equal to X and gain all creature types. So similarly to Drogskol Reinforcements, you could pay 3 into this and give all of your creatures +3/+3, but it's a base buff to power and toughness, so you could combine Mirror Entity with other buff cards or even Drogskol Reinforcements to give your entire board a massive burst of stats and eliminate multiple players with one swing. Definitely a keeper and a must-have in go-wide decks. A classic card that's been around for about 10 years and one I'm happy to see in this precon is Karmic Guide. A 5 mana 2/2 flying spirit with protection from black, and it says when Karmic Guide enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Now there's a pretty good chance our 3 opponents aren't just going to leave us alone while we're trying to develop a massive flying spirit army. So every now and then we're going to lose a couple of our important creatures. Karmic Guide is our insurance policy to get those creatures back, so it can definitely stay in the deck. This one isn't a spirit, but it's also going to help us get some of those important creatures back. We have Angel of Flight Alabaster, a 5 mana 4/4 flyer that says at the beginning of your upkeep, return target spirit card from your graveyard to your hand. It's simple, but effective. It's got decent stats, it attacks in the air, and it came in the precon, so it's free. And the last creature card I decided to keep in the deck is Sire of the Storm. At the end of the video, I'll mention where the deck has some room for you to cut some cards and add some cards that you might already have in your collection, and this is definitely one of them. Sire of the Storm is a 6 mana 3/3, so really expensive for the stats, but it's a flying spirit that says whenever you cast a spirit or arcane spell, draw a card. So essentially, it's a 6 mana do nothing right away, but if it sticks around, you might get to draw 2 or 3 cards. It's got tribal synergy and it's a flyer, but I also wouldn't be offended if you cut this card immediately. And speaking of cutting cards, now let's take a look at the creatures that we'll be removing from the Spirit Squadron precon. First up, of course, is the partner commanders Rhoda and Timon. Tapping stuff down so that we can get our attacks through is a cool idea, but most of our creatures have flying and they're gonna spawn a replacement if they die. So we're not all that concerned with the extra piece of combat step insurance that Rhoda and Timon provide. Another easy cut is the Planeswalker Dovin Grand Arbiter. He's pretty cheap at 3 mana, but what Dovin offers is just too underwhelming. He can create 1/1 flying Thopters, which don't do anything for our tribal synergy, and his ultimate is Scry 10 and draw 3. Yeah, that's a really powerful selective draw effect, but there's just too many extra steps to get to that point. Next, we're going to be getting rid of Ghostly Pilferer, a 2 mana 2/1 spirit rogue. Whenever it becomes untapped, you can pay 2 and draw a card. So this is one of those creatures that were part of the tap theme that we got rid of, and although it can just untap naturally on our upkeep if we attacked with it, it's just too slow for a draw one that we still have to pay 2 mana for. And then the next part of the card is specific to the archetypes that our opponents are playing. If they aren't doing things like casting spells from exile or from the graveyard, then we're never really going to get that card draw. And then finally, we can discard a card to make Ghostly Pilferer unblockable, but we don't really want to be discarding cards either. Shacklegeist is another one of those tappers, a 2 mana 2/2 flying spirit that can only block other creatures with flying, so it's a red flag right there, and it can also tap 2 untapped spirits you control to tap a creature you don't control. So it's really clunky, very little utility, and it can only block other flyers. It's not something we need in the deck. Then there's a couple cards that care about your opponents having more lands than you. We have Priest of the Blessed Graph, a 3 mana 1/2 human cleric, so no tribal synergy there, and it says at the beginning of your end step, create X 1/1 flying spirit tokens, where X is the number of opponents who control more lands than you. So if you're playing with 3 opponents, the most you're going to be getting is 3 spirit tokens. Now this can happen multiple times if it survives through multiple turn rotations, but with only 2 toughness, I wouldn't count on Priest of the Blessed Graph to stick around. Boreas Charger is a similar card, 3 mana for a 2/1 flying Pegasus, again no tribal synergy, and its effect is based on our opponents having more lands than us. The problem with these cards is that in order to reap the benefits, they require us to already be in a losing position or just playing from behind in general. And to be honest, that's just something we want to avoid altogether. And lastly, we have Knight of the White Orchid, 2 white mana for a 2/2 first strike human knight. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you can search your library for a plains and put it onto the battlefield. No tribal synergy, we don't care about the first strike, and the 2 white mana can be hard to cast in the first couple of turns. And again, it's another one of those catch-up cards. I'm more concerned about getting ahead and staying there rather than playing catch-up. Next we have Custodes Squire, a 5 mana 3/3 flying spirit, so a pretty expensive creature, but it says each player votes for an artifact, creature, or enchantment card in your graveyard. Then you get the card with the most votes back to your hand. Now you can play a little bit of politics with somebody and try to get something good back, but with everybody getting a chance to influence the outcome, most of the time you're just going to get something back to your hand that you don't really need or want. The next few cards I cut were trying to contribute to our go wide game plan by generating creature tokens, however they're a bit too slow and too expensive for the effects that they offer. First we have Hanged Executioner, a 3 mana 1/1 flying spirit that creates a 1/1 flying spirit when it enters the battlefield. And then for 3 colorless and 1 white, we can exile this card along with another target creature. So it's not even like a 3 mana removal on a 1/1 stick, it's a 3 mana 1/1 stick that you have to pay 4 more mana into if you actually want the removal. We can do so much better than this. Another 3 mana 1/1 spirit we'll be cutting is Twilight Drover, and it says whenever a creature token leaves the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Twilight Drover. Then you can pay 3 and remove a +1/+1 counter to create 2 1/1 flying spirit tokens. So we pay 3 mana, and then one of our tokens has to die, and then we pay another 3 mana and we can create 2 more tokens? This card kinda just sounds like our commander, but with extra steps. Oyobi Who Split the Heavens is a super expensive 7 mana flying spirit that says whenever you cast a spirit or arcane spell, create a 3/3 flying spirit token. So pretty much a 7 mana do nothing. If this resolves, it's unlikely we'll have any mana left over to create the 3/3 tokens, and we really want to impact the game right away if we're playing a 7-drop. Hallowed Spirit Keeper is a bit too slow and takes a bit too much setup to get a payoff that's just not worth it. It's a 3 mana 3/2 avatar with Vigilance, and when it dies, it creates X 1/1 flying spirit tokens, where X is the number of creatures in your graveyard. If things are going well for us, we shouldn't have too many creatures in our graveyard, so Hallowed Spirit Keeper isn't going to do much. Another card that wants to make creature tokens for us is Geist of Saint Traft, except he creates 4/4 angels that get exiled at the end of combat. So we get a temporary attacker with no tribal synergy, and that's just not good. If we can just leave the token making to our commander, I have a feeling it's going to work out a whole lot better. And the last creature we'll be cutting from the deck is Kami of the Crescent Moon, a spirit that gives us more cards, however it also gives our opponents more cards. At 2 blue mana for a 1/3, I think we can afford to drop this card. So with the keeper and the cuts all accounted for, let's check out the creature cards we'll be adding to our Spirit Squadron deck. The first creature we'll be adding to the deck has to be Selfless Spirit. It's a 2 mana 2/1 flying spirit, so it's checking all the boxes there, but it also lets us sacrifice it to give all of our creatures indestructible until end of turn. In a go wide strategy, we definitely need ways to protect our board, so Selfless Spirit is a must-have. Guardian of Faith is also going to protect our board. It's a 3 mana 3/2 Spirit Knight with Flash and Vigilance, and it says when Guardian of Faith enters the battlefield, any number of other target creatures you control phase out. So if you've never encountered this in a game, when something phases out, it becomes completely untargetable and untouchable until your next turn. Things that phase out basically just aren't part of the game anymore until they phase back in, and Guardian of Faith has Flash. So once you establish a decent sized board that you want to protect, you can leave up 3 mana for this card and protect your creatures from a board wipe at instant speed. Such a great card to have in this deck. We'll also be adding Kami of False Hope, a 1 mana 1/1 spirit that says sacrifice Kami of False Hope, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Short, simple, and effective. Another piece of protection for our go wide strategy. There's a couple cards we'll be adding to the Precon that I actually play myself in my Selesnya deck, and the first one is Skyclave Apparition, a 3-mana 2/2 spirit that enters the battlefield and exiles one non-land, non-token permanent with mana value 4 or less. It's a nice little piece of removal that has tribal synergy with this deck, and when Skyclave Apparition leaves the battlefield, the owner of the exiled card gets an XX token creature, where X is the mana value of the card that we exiled. So let's say one of our opponents has a 2-mana 2/2 on board with a really annoying ability. We can play Skyclave Apparition to exile it, and when Skyclave Apparition finally dies, instead of getting back the annoying 2-mana creature, our opponent just gets a vanilla 2/2 token. This card is awesome. Another piece of interaction that we'll be adding is Mausoleum Wanderer, a 1-mana 1/1 flying spirit, so nothing to write home about, but whenever another spirit enters the battlefield under your control, Mausoleum Wanderer gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and by sacrificing it, we can counter an instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays X, where X is Mausoleum Wanderer's power. So at 1 mana, it's really easy to get this onto the battlefield on turn 1 or 2, it's going to discount our commander, and then later on, I can realistically see a scenario where you could sacrifice Mausoleum Wanderer and make an opponent pay 2 or 3 extra if they want to resolve their spell. This is a solid card for a Spirit Tribal deck. Spell Queller is our other counterspell creature. It's a 3-mana 2/3 spirit with flash and flying. When Spell Queller enters the battlefield, exile target spell with mana value 4 or less. So the flash speed allows you to play this on your opponent's turn to counter their spell. However, it's just a temporary counter because once Spell Queller leaves the battlefield, your opponent can cast the spell you exiled for free. Now at 3 toughness, this temporary counter spell effect could actually last a couple of turns, and maybe even a few table rotations. Each deck usually runs just a few pieces of removal, so there might be juicier targets in play that demand an answer sooner than your Spell Queller. And we also have a few protection pieces of our own to keep Spell Queller safe if need be. I think a lot of people overlook this card because of the temporary aspect of the counter spell, but the spell you counter could actually remain exiled for quite a long time. Nico Ona is our enchantment removal on a stick, and it's a stick that we can pick back up and keep poking people with. For 3 mana, Nico Ona destroys target enchantment when she comes into play, and then when we play a spirit or arcane spell, we get to return Nico Ona to our hand. This is great for multiple reasons, because we have tons of cards in the deck that care about us playing spirit cards, and Nico is a spirit that we can get back and play over and over again. Speaking about cards that care about spirits, we'll be adding Catilda Dawnheart Martyr. 3 mana, flying, lifelink, and protection from vampires. So Catilda directly counters the vampire tribal deck that we talked about in the previous video. Her power and toughness are equal to the number of permanents you control that are spirits and or enchantments, so needless to say, Catilda is going to hit the battlefield as a pretty massive creature that demands an answer. Once that answer is found, we can pay the disturb cost of 3 colorless and 2 white to play the transformed version, which is Catilda's Rising Dawn, a legendary enchantment aura with the same effects as the Catilda creature card. Enchanted creature has flying, lifelink, and protection from vampires, and it gets +X+X, where X is the number of permanents you control that are spirits and or enchantments. This is a really strong card for a Spirit Tribal deck. Mirror Hall Mimic is a 4-mana spirit that's going to let us copy a creature on the battlefield. It's got quite a bit of flexibility because it can copy one of our opponent's creatures with really strong effects, but the copy will be a spirit, so we maintain those tribal benefits. There's also some targets in our own deck that would be great to copy, like Catilda for example, or maybe Drogskull Reinforcements to have a huge combat step. Mirror Hall Mimic gets even better because once it's in the graveyard, we can cast it again for 3 colorless and 2 blue mana, and it becomes an enchantment aura. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a token that's a copy of enchanted creature, except it's a spirit in addition to its other types. So while Mirror Hall Mimic was a once-off copy effect, once it becomes Ghastly Mimicry, it's going to create a token copy every time it gets back to your upkeep. This is easily a card that demands removal twice and adds a ton of utility to our deck. Clarion Spirit is a simple little token generator that we'll be adding to the deck. It's a 2-mana 2/2 spirit, and whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So the card itself has tribal synergy, and the tokens it creates also fit our tribe. For less than 50 cents, Clarion Spirit can get a spot in the deck. Empyrean Eagle is another super cheap card with tribal synergy. It's a 3-mana 2/3 flying spirit that gives a +1/+1 anthem to all of our other creatures with flying. Now, you may have noticed that a very large majority of creatures in this deck have flying, so adding Empyrean Eagle to the deck wasn't hard at all. Mischievous Catgeist is definitely the cutest card in this deck by far, and it's a 2-mana 1/1 spirit that draws us a card whenever it deals combat damage. Now that's a pretty useful effect, except it's on a 1/1 that attacks on the ground. Fortunately, once our Ghost Kitty hits the graveyard, we can pay 2 colorless and a blue and give its effect to one of our creatures as an enchantment aura called Cat-like Curiosity. It's not nearly as cute of a card, but it'll let us stick the effect on one of our flying spirits that's a little harder to block, and hopefully we can draw some cards. Speaking of card draw, we'll also be adding Curiosity Crafter. It isn't a flying spirit, but it is a flying bird wizard, and that definitely counts for something. But Curiosity Crafter says you have no maximum hand size. Whenever a creature token you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Once we've built our massive board of spirits, we're going to need to draw into one of our win conditions, so our bird wizard friend here is going to help us. And the last creature card we'll be adding to the deck is Cemetery Illuminator, a 3-mana 2/3 flying spirit that says whenever Cemetery Illuminator enters the battlefield or attacks, exile a card from a graveyard. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and once each turn, you may cast a spell from the top of your library if it shares a card type with the exiled card. So most of the time when we play this card, we're going to be exiling a creature card, and then once each turn, we can cast the card on top of our library if it's a creature. This is basically like a card draw and allows us to get one card deeper into our deck. Then to expand our options, once Cemetery Illuminator attacks again, we can exile a sorcery or an artifact or an enchantment or whatever card type we want, and then we can cast those from the top of our deck. It's a 3-mana 2/3 flyer with tribal synergy, and it can help us dig through our deck to get more spirits into play, so a great card to add. And that's it for all the changes to creatures in our Spirit Squadron budget upgrade. Now let's take a look at the instants and sorceries that we'll be keeping, removing, and adding. First up, of course we'll be keeping Swords to Plowshares, one of, if not the best single target removal spell in the entire game. What more can you say? Fell the Mighty, a 5-mana board wipe for creatures. There's a bit of flexibility here since it's power-based, and a little more flexibility since you can target an opponent's creature as well. A bit expensive to cast, but free to keep in the deck. Haunting Imitation is another keeper, 3 mana, and each player reveals the top card of their library. For each creature card revealed this way, create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 1/1 and a spirit in addition to its other types, and it has flying. If no creature cards were revealed this way, return Haunting Imitation to its owner's hand. So worst case scenario, we get a couple 1/1 spirits that synergize with the rest of our deck, and then we try again later. The best case scenario is we get a couple of 1/1 spirits that synergize with the rest of our deck, and have some cool abilities. Storm of Souls is expensive at 6 mana, but return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Each of them is a 1/1 spirit with flying in addition to its other types. Exile Storm of Souls. So maybe you've got a win condition or two in your hand and a bunch of creatures in your graveyard. Or maybe just a couple of key creatures like Drogskull Reinforcements that you need to get back. Storm of Souls is your card. Arcane Denial isn't the most efficient counterspell, but it came in the Precon, so it's a free piece of interaction. 2 mana for an instant counterspell. Its controller may draw up to 2 cards at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. And you draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So it has a bit of a downside giving your opponent 2 cards, but if you counter something and it results in you knocking out that player or just straight up winning the game, it doesn't really matter how many cards they get to draw because they're no longer playing. Up next is a bit of a meme card, but I decided to keep it in because in the end, we're going to benefit more from it, and we can use it as a political card to leverage other deals and gain more advantages. It's Benevolent Offering. A 4 mana, choose an opponent, you and that player each create 3 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. I'm sure by now I don't need to explain why that's good for this deck. And then there's part 2, choose an opponent. You gain 2 life for each creature you control, and that player gains 2 life for each creature they control. So you can choose the same opponent or a different opponent, you can choose someone without any creatures so that they don't gain any life, you can choose someone who's already pretty healthy so that the person you're trying to eliminate doesn't get to heal. It's just a pretty cool card with a lot of flexibility, so it can stay in the deck. Next we have Crush Contraband, a simple little removal spell for 3 colorless and 1 white, instant speed, choose 1 or both, exile target artifact, and or exile target enchantment. 4 mana remove 1 thing is a bit expensive, so ideally you'd be casting this when you can hit someone's artifact and an enchantment, but in a pinch you do have the option to remove that 1 thing that's really problematic. And the last sorcery we'll be keeping in the deck is Distant Melody. Choose a creature type, draw a card for each permanent you control of that type. This one is pretty self-explanatory. We're gonna have a ton of spirits on board. The high end of this card can actually be pretty insane if we have a huge board state and Curiosity Crafter. In a situation like that, we could likely just draw into a win condition. But to be more realistic, in most cases we're probably going to have at least 2 spirits on board, so this is a 4 mana draw 2 at its worst. But I think on average, we're going to be drawing 3 or 4 cards off of this. Next we have the instants and sorceries that we'll be cutting from the deck, starting with Disorder in the Court. This is like a temporary board clear, and you have to pay 1 colorless mana per creature, and then you get to create clue tokens for each creature, and then the creatures come back. I don't really get it. The clue tokens aren't valuable enough to play a card like this just to get a few, so this one's an easy cut. Another easy one is Flood of Tears, 6 mana for a board wipe that returns all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. It's super expensive, and if we're playing this deck properly, most of our non-land permanents are going to be spirit tokens, and everybody knows that tokens have a no return policy. Once they leave the battlefield, they are gone forever, so no thank you, Flood of Tears. Kurtar's Wrath is another board clear we don't need. It's really expensive to cast, and there's a pretty big requirement here just to get 2 spirit tokens. There's just a lot of other cards in the deck that already do both of these things a lot better and for a lot less mana. Sudden Salvation is one of those cards designed to protect our creatures so that our go-wide game plan can actually do its thing. It's also got an interesting little political aspect where you can return opponents' creatures from the graveyard back to the battlefield and then draw a card for each enemy creature. But overall, this card is just too expensive, too slow, and too specific. We've got other tools that we mentioned earlier that do a much better job of protecting our board and bringing back our important creatures. And finally, we'll be getting rid of Occult Epiphany. Draw X cards, then discard X cards. Create a 1/1 spirit creature token with flying for each card type among the cards discarded this way. Now we do like the spirit tokens, but we don't really want to be discarding our resources. We have better ways to draw cards, and they're actually going to put us at a card advantage afterwards. Now let's talk about the instants and sorceries that we'll be adding to the deck, starting with Kabira Takedown. This is another card that I play in my Selesnya deck. It's a 2 mana and it deals damage to a creature or planeswalker equal to the number of creatures you control. This card is actually a lot better in the Spirit Squadron deck since it wants to go really wide, but if you're in a tight situation and you need the mana, it's an MDFC with Kabira Plateau on the other side. March of Souls is a 5 mana symmetrical board wipe on creatures, but if the timing is right when we use this, our board is going to look the exact same afterwards. March of Souls says destroy all creatures, they can't be regenerated. For each creature destroyed this way, its controller creates a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So ideally, we'll be wiping out a few big threats of our opponents, and we might lose a creature or 2 of our own, but our deck is actually designed to put those leftover spirits to good use. Similarly, we have Perplexing Test, another 5 mana creature board wipe, but you choose 1. Return all creature tokens to their owner's hands, or return all non-token creatures to their owner's hands. Now obviously that first choice is just destroy all token creatures since they can't get bounced, but the actual creatures in our deck are really inexpensive. So in a sticky situation, or after someone has just spent a lot of mana getting a big creature out, we can use Perplexing Test to bounce all creatures back, and then we're gonna have a much easier time getting ours back into play. Austere Command is a little bit more expensive at 6 mana, but this time we get to choose 2. Destroy all artifacts, destroy all enchantments, destroy all creatures with mana value 3 or less, and the last option is destroy all creatures with mana value 4 or more. This card offers tons of utility, it's really flexible, and if we choose that last option, then most of the time our board will be safe. Another creature board wipe we'll be adding is Hour of Reckoning. It's 7 mana, but it says Convoke. Your creatures can tap to pay for 1 towards this spell. So in a go-wide deck like Spirit Squadron, realistically we'll be casting this at 3 or 4 mana, maybe even 2. It's a really great card in this deck, and it's less than 50 cents, so why not? Now the last 2 sorceries we'll be adding might be a little controversial depending on your playgroup, but these 2 spells are part of the win condition group of cards that I've mentioned a couple of times. The first one is Part the Water Veil. 4 colorless and 2 blue mana, take an extra turn after this one. Yes, an extra turn spell, and that's not the only one. We'll also be adding Karn's Temporal Sundering. The same casting cost of 4 colorless and 2 blue, target player takes an extra turn after this one. Now obviously both of these cards say more than just take an extra turn, but the extra turn is really the big finisher here. I'm sure you've pieced it together by now. The plan is to build a huge board, buff them all up with cards like Drogskull Reinforcements and Mirror Entity, and then with our extra turn spells we're gonna win through combat. Now like I said, some people aren't fond of things like extra turns in their playgroups, so it's always nice to have a Rule 0 conversation to make sure you can do what this deck was meant to do, and everyone can have a good time. With all that out of the way, it's time to talk about the enchantments, artifacts, and lands. You might start to notice that there aren't too many changes in these categories, but don't worry, I'll explain why that is at the end, and how you can still optimize the mana base for little to no additional cost. First, let's talk enchantments. We'll be keeping all the enchantments included in the Precon except for Verity's Circle and Promise of Bunray. Verity's Circle was part of the sub-theme that we got rid of that cared about tapping creatures, and Promise of Bunray is just too risky of a setup for a handful of tokens. If someone removes it before you get the payoff, then you just spent 3 mana to do nothing. The enchantments that we're keeping are Breath of the Sleepless. This one's gonna let us cast our spirits at flash speed. We have Darksteel Mutation. This applies a humility effect to a threatening creature that we can't deal with. Same thing with Imprisoned in the Moon. This also has a humility type effect that we can use to get rid of something. Field of Souls is going to let us keep repopulating our battlefield with tokens that have tribal synergy. Similarly, we also have Haunted Library. We can pay 1 every time a creature dies and then create a flying spirit token. Ghostly Prison is there to help us slow things down a little bit while we establish our side of the board. And lastly, there's Reconnaissance Mission. This enchantment is going to help us draw cards. There wasn't any room in the budget to add any enchantments to the deck, but if I had to recommend one, it would be Bident of Thassa. It's similar to Recon Mission, except you attach it to a creature, and that itself kind of makes it easier to remove in my opinion, so I wasn't exactly desperate to squeeze this card in. Next up, let's talk artifacts. We'll be keeping most of them again, with Arcane Signet, Azorius Signet, Azorius Locket, Commander Sphere, and of course, Soul Ring. We're going to be getting rid of Sky Diamond and Marble Diamond, the obligatory untapped mana rocks, as well as Midnight Clock. It scales up with Commander really well, but it still needs to survive 3 entire table rotations, so I'm not going to hold my breath. As replacements for these, we'll be adding Mind Stone and Fractured Power Stone. And finally, everyone's favorite card type, the lands. We'll be removing Unclaimed Territory, Temple of the False God, and Azorius Chancery, and leaving in the other 9 land cards included in the Precon. We have Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, Moorland Haunt, Myriad Landscape, Path of Ancestry, Port Town, Prairie Stream, Skycloud Expanse, and Temple of Enlightenment. Finding their way into our very tight budget, we'll also be adding Gaia Reach Sanitarium, Nimbus Maze, irrigated farmland, and glacial floodplain. And just to be thorough, I should also mention that we're adding 1 basic island and 1 basic plains. So with that being said, the final budget of the deck at the time of recording is $49.80. Now you might have noticed that a lot of the artifacts, lands, and even the enchantments went untouched. This is because a majority of the budget went into the creatures, instants, and sorceries. In order to make a deck build that I felt would play relatively consistently and actually be able to secure some wins, there was a lot of changes that needed to be made to really hone in on the tribal synergy and the go-wide archetype. The creature additions are about $35 worth of the budget, the instants and sorceries were about $10, and the last $5 went to the enchantments and the mana base. However, I did say there are ways to optimize the mana base for little to no additional cost, and that's because if this isn't your first Precon deck, there's a good chance you already have better artifacts and lands just laying around in your collection. The first thing I would do is get rid of Exotic Orchard, a couple of basic lands, and maybe even Commander Sphere, and then put in some better dual lands or mana rocks. Meandering River, Tranquil Cove, and Expedition Map are all great choices for mana fixing that are really inexpensive if you don't already have a copy. Another way you could reposition the budget and add a bit of your own flavor to the deck is by swapping out the most expensive cards, Selfless Spirit, Cemetery Illuminator, and Skyclave Apparition. These cards are all about $7 each, so if you already have them in your collection or you have cards you want to replace them with, that would free up a big chunk of the $50 budget that you could put elsewhere. But that's it for my Spirit Squadron Precon Upgrade Guide. As mentioned previously, you can find a link to the deck list in the video description below, as well as a spreadsheet with a list of all the cards to keep, remove, and add, and the prices for all the additions. I definitely recommend checking out the link to the deck list because if you click stats up here at the top, you can see the mana curve as well as the number of creature and non-creature spells at each mana value. And one last thing that I like to mention is the hand simulator. I actually have a ton of fun just rolling through hands and imagining how the first few turns of each game would play out, so give it a try. Let me know what you think of this deck list in the comments down below, and check out my Vampiric Bloodline Precon upgrade video if you haven't yet already. Leave a comment, make sure you subscribe, and send this video to a friend, and I'll catch you next time.